Alright, so as a quick warning before we start the video, I'd like to quickly apologize for a bit of a goof I made during the production of this. So throughout basically the entirety of this video, you will find that weirdly the gameplay footage for Xenosaga 2 is cropped for some reason. This is because during Xenosaga Episode 1, because, I'm unfortunately having to emulate this, I had a problem where in order to get it to record right, I had to crop some of the footage on OBS. So going into Xenosaga 2, I figured, it would have the same problem since it had the same resolution, it was on the same emulator. As it turns out, it didn't. I never bothered to actually check, so now, all of the footage for Episode 2 is just weirdly cropped, and I have no way of fixing it without straight up re-recording the entire game. I promise Episode 3 is not gonna have this problem. I'm gonna get my act together for that one, but I hope you enjoy this review regardless. The first episode of Xenosaga was a decent enough time. The story it set up was interesting, and while the combat wasn't perfect, I enjoyed it for what it was. As a start to a much larger story, Episode 1 did a fine enough job at getting your feet wet into the lives of these characters and the world itself. In preparation for this video though, I ended up finding out that apparently the second episode of this series was fairly controversial for being, not that great. Not only is it easily the shortest game in the series at roughly 10-ish hours shorter than the first, it's also apparently known for having bad combat and a terrible presentation. So while all of this isn't exactly reassuring for me, I'm not gonna let that stop me from trying to enjoy it. For all I know, and with any luck, maybe I'll actually really like the game. Only one way to find out though. Let's dig into what many consider the worst game in the Xeno series with Episode 2, Jenseits von Gut. And I deeply apologize to any Germans out there whose lifespan I just lowered from how hard I made you cringe just now. After the events of Xenosaga 1, the gang find themselves on Second Miltia, both for Cosmos' new frame and to get more info on the mysterious Y data stored inside Momo. The story of Episode 2 focuses on almost primarily developing two parts of the overarching story. The Miltian conflict from 14 years ago in the URTVs, the 669 genetically modified children designed to combat the wave existence Udu. Whereas 1's plot had a lot of setup for the overall story, Episode 2's feels a lot more personal, with Junior and returning villain Albedo also being URTVs themselves. The game spends a lot of time developing Junior's relationship with his brother, and to be honest, it did a lot for Albedo's character for me. In the first game, he came off as just some crazy guy, but this one did a lot to explore his character and why he is the way he is. Frankly, the actual story for Xenosaga 2 is actually fairly good, and despite every problem this game has, it at least gets this right. Before moving on to the next section though, we need to talk about the visual elephant in the room that is Episode 2's very, interesting shift in its presentation. So, for whatever reason, the guys at Monolith decided to go for a bit more of a realistic approach to Episode 2's visuals, and while I can't say it's totally bad, some characters don't look that great. Ziggy, Junior, and even Albedo all look fine, but Shion, Cosmos, and even Momo all look different to a point where it's kinda jarring. Making things worse is that they're also weirdly inexpressive compared to a lot of other characters, with them having very static facial expressions compared to everyone else. Cosmos is probably the worst offender for me just because of how uncanny she looks compared to the main cast. I'll give her this though, I do like the new effect for her hair, it's a nice touch. For the first time in a video ever, I also have to complain about the voice acting, because while it's not all bad, the new voices they brought on for Shion, Chaos, and Momo don't exactly sound great. Shion's just doesn't sound that good, the raw audio quality for Momo sounds kinda weird to me, and Chaos is for some reason monotone in this game. Normally I don't really care about less than stellar voice acting, but with both how jarring the shift is and the actual quality of the voice acting, it took me out of the experience a few times. That being said though, I can forgive a poor presentation a little bit if the game itself is fun, and Xenosaga 2 is kinda fun, until it isn't. So here's the thing with Episode 2's gameplay. I don't feel like the core combat in and of itself is actually bad. In fact, for the first major dungeon of the game, I was actually having a really good time. Combat in Xenosaga 2 plays very differently to Episode 1. While there are a few similar base elements, like the button combos for attacks and boosting, there's a lot more complexities to the whole thing. This time around, every attack has a specified zone, with square attacks being B zone and triangle attacks being C zone. Each enemy has a certain zone combo they're weak to, and by using that combo on them, you can get extra damage by breaking them, and even allowing for down and air effects for even more damage. Certain characters can down or air an enemy after breaking them by using special circle attacks via Episode 2's new stock mechanic. Everyone can stock a maximum of 3 points, and by doing so, you can string together an extra 3 attacks in a combo. Boosting got a change as well this time around, with it being one shared pool across the party instead of 3 separate pools. I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion at all, but I actually like how boosting works here more than in the first game. In Episode 1, I only really got use out of boosts during boss fights, but in Episode 2, I found myself utilizing it in normal enemy encounters a lot more, and it being a shared pool adds a bit more strategy to fights. Heck, it even made me pay attention to the event slot more. This was a thing in the first game, but I didn't need to pay attention to it much. Here, though, I found myself keeping an eye on it more, not only thanks to all its other effects, but also thanks to the fact that it can increase how much you gain on the boost gauge when you attack. The mechs return as well, and they're definitely handled a lot better here. Instead of using them in normal combat, you utilize them separately. Combine that with the fact that you don't have to worry about upgrading them, and the mechs were far more fun and easier to use here. Unfortunately, though, that's about all the positive things I have left to say about the gameplay. The idea behind the combat is fun and interesting, even if it might be a bit too complex for a turn-based RPG, but it's the execution of everything else that really brings it down. Let's start with the game's class and skill systems. In Episode 1, every character had a unique tree for unlocking ether skills that you could then also give to other characters. In Episode 1, though, everyone has access to a set of 4 levels of abilities, each divided into multiple different class tiers. This is how you get ether abilities and passive buffs, and honestly, I'm not a fan of how this was executed. One problem with it is that you have a very limited pool of class points, with primarily the only way you can get them being from unlocking a full set of abilities and by defeating bosses. With how many options there are at the player's disposal and no real point of reference for where to start, it's likely anyone blind to the game like me might make a few poor decisions for skills early on. The other problem is that building up skill points from fights to get new abilities isn't exactly a fast process in the beginning, so it's possible the first 5 or 6 hours could be really hard, either because they bought the wrong skills or they aren't maximizing possible damage output with the elemental sword abilities, because the enemies in the game make combat a nightmare at a lot of points. Let me tell ya, I was genuinely shocked at the difficulty spike once I got to the game's second dungeon. Like, the first one was fairly nice to get through, but then I get to this one and suddenly I'm getting my butt handed to me on a silver platter by the Gnosis. Enemies in Episode 2 can hit pretty hard, and surviving in the beginning of the game is pretty difficult because you don't have any great healing abilities and you have very few healing items. Making things worse though is that enemy encounters take forever. Like, I've had boss fights in this game that take less time than some normal fights. And this is the other part of the problem. The game forces you to really learn a lot of the complexities for Episode 2's combat very early on. To maximize survivability and to reduce how long fights take, you need to learn the ins and outs of combat. Abusing the boost mechanic while an enemy's down or in the air for more damage will be needed for some later fights in the game, because your base damage doesn't change much by level and enemies get a lot of health. It's honestly a shame this is such a massive problem, because I do genuinely like the base combat outside of the new class and skill system, but the sheer tedium of encounters makes playing through Episode 2 a massive chore at points. Xenosaga 2, while not being the worst thing I've ever played, isn't exactly great. It's not terrible, but I can't say it's good either. While not awful, its presentation is kinda jarring in a few areas, with the only thing it does really well consistently being the music. Its gameplay leaves a lot to be desired thanks to how annoying and tedious it is despite how fun the core mechanics of combat can be, and how nice an improvement the mech sections here are compared to Episode 1. Thanks to the game's length, there's also an unfortunately small amount of things to talk about if the length of this video didn't already suggest that. Like, we're 2 games into this series and I'm genuinely baffled that I still don't have enough to say about the story to make a spoiler section, despite that being the best part of this game. It's definitely my least favorite entry in the Xeno series by a mile, which kinda sucks because I actually liked the first game a good amount. Here's hoping the finale for the trilogy leaves a really great impression on me, because I'd hate to have this trilogy end on a whimper. Thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.